Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. I'm so thankful you've stopped by. In this video, I'm going to share with you how I created this card here using some Distress ink pad or oxide pad reinkers. The first thing we're going to do is use some glossy alcohol ink cardstock, and I'm going to emboss with my 3D Roses embossing folder. Now, if you haven't used 3D embossing folders before, I like to mist both sides of my paper a couple times, and then I put it through my machine back and forth a couple times just to really get all that 3D texture into the paper. I'm using glossy cardstock here because I'm trying to do a oxide removal technique or lift technique later on in the video, and it works best on this alcohol ink cardstock. You may have noticed when I took the paper out of the embossing folder, I've got some ink transfer because I didn't clean my embossing folder from a previous technique. It's not going to make a difference for this particular technique, but it is a reminder to clean your tools if you get ink residue or use them with different ink techniques so that when you go to use them next time, they're nice and clean and ready to go. So I've got several different Distress Oxide refills here. I'll have them all listed and linked in the description below. This technique will work with any colors. I'm just using colors that I wanted to try out for this particular technique in this way. I'm putting a little bit on my mat and then I'm painting them on different areas. I have several different pinks, a couple different greens, and several different blues for the background. I'm trying to get some lighter areas and darker areas. And the reason I'm using Distress Oxide is because when I go to mist them with water later, they're going to oxidize and they're going to get chalky looking. And I really like the look of that chalkiness that they create. When we go and remove some of the color, we're going to get some of the dye properties of the oxide ink revealed, and that is not going to have that chalky finish. So we're going to get a contrast in texture between the glossy cardstock and the chalky background. So I'm just taking my different colors and I'm painting them with a water brush. I have a water brush here that has water in the handle, and it works really easily because if you're going to go and switch colors, you just squeeze a little bit out on a paper towel, rub it off, and your brush is clean and good to go and ready for the next color. You may notice me putting some splatters on my background in between different colors. This is actually something I wanted to see a splattered background on it, but you actually don't notice any of the splatters at the end. So if you're going to try this technique, don't bother doing the splattering. You're not going to notice it. It's kind of a waste of time. But what I had envisioned in my head, it was going to look really cool. But it's always funny, some of the things that you have envisioned just don't work out, and some totally do. I've got my main image painted already, and I'm just going and doing the background. I've got 4 different blue colors. I'm trying to do the lightest color around the flowers and the darkest around the edge of the paper. I want something that will frame the whole piece. When I go and spray this with water, those colors are going to nicely bleed and run in together and create a really cool background that I am absolutely thrilled with how it turned out. I'm making sure to do this painting fairly quickly so that those colors do blend and mix with each other. Because I'm using alcohol ink cardstock, and alcohol ink cardstock, if you've never used it before, it's a clay-coated cardstock that has a glossy finish. These inks will sit on the surface for a little while before seeping into them. They will seep into them because it is a porous surface, but it does stay on the surface longer than it does with regular cardstock. Once I was finished with my image, I am using my heat tool to dry it. And it did take quite a while to dry this. I've got this sped up fairly well. And there were some areas that just didn't want to dry. So you'll see in a little bit, I will switch from my heated tool, which has a gentler heat, to my embossing tool, which is a more concentrated and direct heat. Is a little bit more intense, but it was the only way really to get some of those areas to actually dry because they just didn't want to. I'll lift it up in a second here and you can see those areas that are still wet. Now, I could have taken a paper towel and lifted some of that ink up, but I was really loving how that background looks, so I didn't want to actually do that and remove any of that ink and risk losing some of those areas. So by taking the embossing tool and working it on this background, I did end up getting those areas to completely dry. You do want to be a little bit more careful when you're drying with an embossing tool because it is a much more intense heat. You could actually scorch the paper. So we want to avoid having that paper scorched, which creates a burned look on the paper. But it does work to dry all of those areas that need to be dried. So now that that background is completely dry, I'm taking some Distress Micro Glaze, and I have a foam pad on my tool here. It fits perfectly into this little pot. So I have this foam pad and this tool that is just for my micro glaze, so I'm not removing that pad and getting the micro glaze all over my fingers and making a mess. I'm just using it to rub over the raised areas of my embossed image. Now I want to try to keep that micro glaze concentrated to my raised areas. I don't want to have it on any of the background or anything. And really, it's not going to go over the entire raised background. It's only going to be on the uppermost parts of it. So some of my flower and my leaves are still going to be the chalky finish from the Oxide ink. I'm only going to get some glossy dye reveal from the most raised areas. And I do this with a light hand at first, and then I will go back and go a little bit harder just to get a little bit more reveal out of it. By going with a lighter hand, you can control how much of a reveal you get. If you do a heavy-handed to start out with and take off more than you really want, you can't get that back unless you're going to go back and paint that Distress Oxide inks over top of it. Once I was happy with how that looked, I took my background here and I just cut about 1/8 of an inch off of each edge just to narrow it down a little bit, so when I go put it on a card base, I'm still going to see a different color of a card base. I could have taken that whole background and put it right onto a card the way it was and only seen that, but I do like the way it looks to have a matte, a matte around the image. Before I go with my next step, I'm taking some Uncharted Mariner Oxide ink, and I'm just inking the edges. Uncharted Mariner was one of the colors that I used to do the background, and it's the color that I used on the outermost edge. So I wanted to reinforce that. I like inking the edge of the cardstock just because it tends to make it darker and it just frames it, and I just think it gives it a nice finished look. Once that is complete, I'm going to take some Foundry Wax, and I've got it in the silver color here, and I'm just going to put a little bit of that Foundry Wax on the raised edge. Now I hadn't intended to do this originally, but when I was using the Splatter Brush on the background, I had a little bit of dried up Foundry Wax on there, so I got some of that dust in the background, and when I used my heat tool to dry my background off, I got some of the little metallic flecks from it, and I really liked the look of it, and I wanted to really tie that into the main image of the card. So I'm taking that Foundry Wax, just putting a little bit on some of the edges of the petals. Once I have that how I want, I'm going to take a little bit of Foundry Wax and I'm going to mix it with some isopropyl alcohol and take out that splatter brush again, and I'm going to splatter some dots over the background just to get a little bit of that silver metallic fleck back there. Now, if you've never used Foundry Wax before, it is a liquid leafing wax, but in order to get that leafing to show, you need to use a heat tool afterwards, and it raises it to the surface. You don't need to heat it nearly as long as you would if you were heat embossing a stamped image. It comes up a lot quicker, but it makes that Foundry Wax really nice and glossy and beautiful. This is a product that was released about a year or so ago, and really I don't know how in the world we lived without it before time, because I use it so often, and I actually noticed this silver one must be the one that I use the most because my bottle is nearly empty and I'm going to need to get some more. It's a beautiful way to add just a metallic shimmer, and it gets applied in a different way from leafing flakes. So you just get a completely different look that I think is really fun and unique. Once that is completely done, I'm going to glue my background here to my card base. I chose a nice light pink card base. It's going to bring out some of the pink in the flowers, but it's not going to compete with that image. I was in love with how that image looked, and I didn't want to basically draw any attention away from it. When I glue a background onto my card, I typically like to put an acrylic block on top, and then I have a jar full of beads that give it a little bit of weight. So I'm going to put that on there and let that dry. 3D folders have a lot of dimension to them, so you want to make sure to put glue on the areas that are going to stick to your card base. I have a foiled sentiment that I did from a previous project, and I typically will do extras and have them sitting in a container just to grab when I need it. So I'm going to add that to the front of my card. It's just a silver foil, so it brings in or it ties in with the leafing that we added to the front of the card. Put that on there, and because it's a 3D folder, again, I'm using my acrylic block to hold it down to let it dry. And here is the completed card with the beautiful silver accents. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fabulous day.